Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Colin Murphy. I'm the Policy Director here at the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar we're presenting today about modeling induced travel demand or induced travel. I'd like to let you all know, for those of you who've been watching many of our webinars, we've been doing these about once a month for the last several months. We're planning to take a bit of a break through summer, but this webinar series will return in the fall for more reports and discussions about the research coming out of NCST on what we anticipate will be an at least monthly basis. With that, I'd like to turn things over to the NCST Director, Dr. Susan Handy. Susan?
Thanks, Colin, and welcome to everybody who's out there listening in. I wanted to give just a little bit of background about this project before I turn it over to Jamey Volker, who did most of the work and will be going through the calculator itself, and then we'll be hearing from our panelists, and I believe Colin will be introducing them, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So this induced travel calculator grew out of some work that I did with Marlon Bornett and a host of very helpful helpers for the California Air Resources Board a few years ago. We were given the job of summarizing the empirical research on a whole bunch of different strategies for reducing vehicle miles of travel, or what we will talk about today as VMT. And one of the last topics we looked at was highway capacity and this question of induced travel. So what's interesting is that since that time, and since we published a research brief on that topic, this has been the topic that I have most often been contacted about by journalists, as well as community groups, not just from California, but across the country. The last one being a conversation with a journalist in Alabama last week. So clearly, this question of induced travel from added highway capacity is something that a lot of communities are really struggling to understand. At the same time, over that same period of time, California has adopted policies that require an assessment of the impacts of VMT of proposed land development and transportation projects, as we're going to hear more about from our panelists. And though we have some tools that can help communities do this kind of analysis, such as travel demand forecasting models, you know, sometimes a simpler sort of sketch tool is needed. And so given the interest in this topic of induced travel and this need for simple ways to do analysis of VMT impacts, we saw a need for the development of this induced travel calculator. So we're very pleased to have launched that and put it up on the website. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jamey Volker, who's going to tell us more about the calculator. Unless, Colin, are you stepping in to do a little more introduction?
I just wanted to mention to the panelists that there is a Q&A function available through Zoom, and so if you have questions, please use that, and we will try to take questions at the end, though if we have questions that seem like they need immediate clarification, I may interrupt our speakers to try to get those. You can also use the Zoom chat window. Given that we've got quite a few attendees, I think we're going to try to stick with chat and Q&A questions rather than trying to open this up, because it may get a little too complicated if we try to do that. So please use the Q&A window. And with that, I think we're ready to have Jamey start the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you much, Susan and Colin. It's my pleasure to be here today to discuss our induced travel calculator. And without further ado, let me provide an outline of what I am going to discuss. All right. So I'll start with a summary of the historical approach to congestion management. I will then discuss the induced travel effect. And following that, I'll summarize how induced travel is measured. I'll then describe NCST's induced travel calculator and run through how to use it. We'll then hear from our guest respondents, Chris Gansan and Gordon Gary, and then we will respond to questions from the audience, as Colin just mentioned. So, how have we traditionally attempted to manage congestion? Well, generally by increasing automobile capacity, usually by either building new roadways or adding lanes to existing roadways. Now, some jurisdictions are moving away from capacity additions and attempting to manage congestion using primarily transportation demand management measures, for example, San Francisco and Pasadena, but capacity additions are still very commonly prescribed. So, for example, as originally introduced, Senator Morlock's recent bill, SB 319, would have added lanes along the entirety of Interstate 5 and California Route 99 to ostensibly reduce congestion and greenhouse gas emissions. So those prescriptions have since been excised, but it's still a good example of the prevalence of adding capacity as the preferred approach to managing congestion. So diagrammatically, the historical approach to congestion management looks like this. So to treat the problem of increased traffic, we add automobile capacity, and the intended effect is to reduce traffic. However, the problem with adding capacity is that it doesn't end in the steady state of reduced congestion and faster speeds. It actually has the unintended effect of inducing more auto travel on the expanded corridor. So the induced travel effect is well documented in the academic literature, dating back to Anthony Downs' seminal 1962 article, The Law of Peak Hour Expressway Congestion, and it can be explained by bedrock economic principles. So adding roadway capacity in congested areas reduces the time cost of driving. And when the price of driving goes down, vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, go up. And then with increasing VMT, congestion can return to pre-capacity expansion levels relatively quickly. This is called the fundamental law of road congestion, and it has both short-term and long-term elements. So in the short term, travel behavior, for example, is impacted as people drive more to take advantage of the faster speeds. And that could be drivers who are already driving and they just choose to drive more or longer distances, or it could be people who are choose to change modes from, say, transit or walking or biking to driving to, again, take advantage of the faster speeds. Then there are also longer term impacts as economic and residential migration and relocation happens to take advantage of the increased mobility in the area where the capacity was expanded. It's also important to note that induced travel can occur even in relatively uncongested areas, where adding roadway capacity can increase or increases access to previously less accessible areas and thereafter spur economic development and residential migration into those places. But for purposes of this discussion, we're focusing primarily on areas where you have metropolitan areas where you do have congestion, and that is the intended purpose of or the intended problem for which adding capacity is intended to cure. So depicted graphically, the induced travel effects looks like this. So instead of the intended effect of steady state congestion relief, the reduced congestion and lower time cost of driving induced more driving, which then increases congestion and can start the whole process over again in an unhealthy feedback loop. So how, though, is induced travel effects, how is it measured? And how big is the impact? Well, first, I'll just show you more descriptively what the induced travel effect looks like. A nice cartoon. Basically, you add a lane, you're stuck eventually at the same level of congestion that you had, 5 to 10 years previously. But how do we measure this? How do we know that this impact occurs, and how do we measure the magnitude of the impact? So the magnitude of the effect is commonly measured as the elasticity of vehicle miles traveled with respect to lane miles. So the elasticity is the percent change in VMT divided by the percent change in lane miles. And so the greater the elasticity, the greater the increase in VMT from a given increase in roadway capacity. An elasticity of 1.0, for example, indicates that a given percent increase in lane miles will cause the same percent increase in VMT. And when VMT increases by the same proportion as roadway capacity, it means congestion levels will remain the same. Indeed, they may even worsen on streets around the expanded facility, since those streets must carry the increased auto traffic to and from the expanded facility. So what about the range of elasticities that the research has shown? So the range of, well, this is actually from, as summarized in work that Dr. Handy referred to, that she did with Marlon Bornett. And as they found in their 2014 review of induced travel elasticity studies, most recent studies estimate a long-term VMT elasticity between 0.6 and 1.0 for major roads in congested or metropolitan areas. And more recent studies have also confirmed this. For example, Kent Heimel's 2019 study, in which he found a long-term elasticity of about 1.0 for highways in census-defined urban areas across the United States, using data from 1981 through 2015. It also bears mentioning that most studies using instrumental variables have estimated long-term elasticities right around 1.0, and the instrumental variable approach is generally regarded as essential to control for the endogeneity of lane miles, so the bidirectional relationship between lane miles and VMT. The relatively close agreement amongst the recent induced travel elasticity studies is important for two reasons. First, it leaves increasingly little doubt that expanding capacity on major roadways in congested areas does, in fact, induce more auto travel and increase VMT, and it does so in sufficient quantities to substantially reduce or even negate congestion reduction benefits within a few years, usually 5 to 10 years. Second, it provides us with clear guideposts for estimating the VMT induced by new capacity expansion projects, which is exactly what our induced travel calculator does on a sketch type basis. Understanding the magnitude of the induced travel impact and having the ability to measure induced VMT on a project level basis are both increasingly important for California. So as the California Air Resources Board has recognized in its 2030 scoping plan and 2018 progress report on implementing Senate Bill 375, VMT is key to meeting California's GHG emissions reduction goals. In addition, as Susan mentioned, jurisdictions across California are increasingly using VMT as a measure of transportation system performance, as well as the environmental impacts and public health effects of new land use developments and transportation projects. And that's largely due to Senate Bill 743, pursuant to which the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the Natural Resources Agency developed CEQA guidelines requiring agencies to replace auto level of service with VMT as the primary metric of transportation impact significance under CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, at least for land use development related projects. But some agencies have been experimenting for some time with VMT-based methods for analyzing transportation impacts and imposing related exactions. OPR's webpage on transportation impacts, which I just put the link up to here, provides many good resources for understanding VMT's broad impacts, from impacts to the transportation system and environmental impacts to public health and fiscal impacts. Anyway, long story short, being able to estimate the VMT induced from roadway capacity expansions, at least to the correct order of magnitude, will be increasingly useful for land use planning, transportation planning, public health evaluation, and environmental impact analysis, for example, as done under the California Environmental Quality Act. And that is where our calculator comes in handy. So the purpose of our calculator is to provide a simple estimate of induced travel, so additional VMT per year from certain types of projects. And what type of projects does our calculator apply to? Well, it applies to adding projects that add general purpose or high occupancy vehicle lane miles to major roadways in the California highway system. And that includes roadways that have the Federal Highway Administration classification 1, 2, or 3. And so class 1 facilities are interstate highways like I-5, I-80, or I-10. Class 2 facilities are other freeways and expressways, including US routes like Highway 101 or Highway 50, and many state routes. And class 3 facilities are other principal arterials like Highway 13 in the Bay Area, Arden Way in Sacramento, Santa Monica Boulevard in Los Angeles, or parts of Highway 1 along the coast. We provide links to the classification system and the California Highway System map on our Induced Travel Calculator website. But so it doesn't apply to these facilities in all jurisdictions. What geographies does it apply to? Our calculator can be used for FHWA class 1, 2, or 3 facilities in California's urbanized counties. And so what are urbanized counties? Those are counties within a metropolitan statistical area. So our calculator covers the 37 counties in California within a metropolitan statistical area, which also have in the county either class 1, class 2, or class 3 facilities. And so how does the calculator actually work? So the calculator solves this simple equation. So VMT induced by a capacity expansion project equals the percent change in lane miles on that facility within the relevant geography times the existing vehicle miles traveled on that facility in that relevant geography multiplied by an elasticity. And so what data does the calculator use for the equation inputs? Well, there are 6 inputs to our calculator, and 3 of which the calculator supplies, and 3 of which the user inputs. So the user inputs the relevant geography, the type of facility to which lanes are proposed to be added, for example, an interstate class 2 or a class 3 facility, and the number of lane miles proposed to be added. The calculator then queries a spreadsheet to determine the total existing lane miles of the same facility type in the same geography, the existing annual VMT on those facilities in that geography, and the applicable elasticity. So the existing lane miles, as well as the existing VMT, are both from 2016 data from Caltrans performance measurement system. And the spreadsheet that has this data can be downloaded from the calculator webpage. And as we receive more recent data, we will update the data and the calculator from time to time. So what about the elasticities? So the elasticities we use are from the academic literature, which I briefly overviewed, and we explain their selection in more detail on the calculator website. But as you can see, the elasticities we use, 1.0 for class 1 facilities and 0.75 for class 2 and 3 facilities, are squarely within the 0.6 to 1.0 range of 5 to 10-year elasticities reported in the literature for major roads in congested areas, just as Dr. Handy and Marlon Bournette found in 2014, and just as more recent studies have confirmed. So now that we've gone over the more technical basics of the calculator, you might be wondering how the calculator interface works. So before I get into a demonstration, I'll just put up again, and this is for posterity, since these slides will be posted online, and so you can access them later as well. So here is the URL from which you can access the calculator, and I just wanted to mention that this link goes to a website that will take you to a separate website where the calculator is temporarily hosted. I'm not showing the current URL for the actual calculator because we will be changing the platform and hosting for it soon, so the URL will change. But this URL here will remain and will provide a correct link to the calculator's ultimate hosting location. In any event, in terms of using the calculator website does provide detailed instructions, but I wanted to finish my presentation by running through a quick demonstration of how to use the calculator. So this is the view from the calculator interface page, and you'll start off by scrolling down to where it says calculator, and then you'll select your facility type. And that's done right here in the circled area. And you'll choose either a interstate highway, a class 1 facility, or a class 2 or 3 facility. So let's say you're reading the original version of SB 319, Senator Morlock's bill, and we're wondering how much annual VMT would increase if we added lanes to 90-ish centerline miles of I-5 in Los Angeles County. So you would choose, class 1 interstate facility there, and then it would take you to the facility type page, or it would open up a little box beneath it where you would select your facility type, and you would select the relevant metropolitan statistical area that Los Angeles County is within, so the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim MSA. Then you would enter the lane miles to be added by the project. And here I entered 90, which is approximately the equivalent of adding one additional lane, i.e. an additional lane in one direction, to the entire length of I-5 through LA County. Then you click the Calculate Induced Travel button, and voila, you have you get your answer of 774.8 million additional vehicle miles traveled per year. And the calculator, as you can see, also reports back the underlying data values used to compute the estimate. So let's say, however, that you were curious about the impact of adding lanes to a class 2 or a class 3 facility, like Highway 99 coming into Chico from Sacramento. The only difference for the user is that you'll select class 2 or class 3 facility rather than interstate highway, and then choose the relevant county as your geography, rather than metropolitan statistical area as with class 1 facilities. So for the portion of 99 near Chico, which is a class 3 facility, we'd choose Butte County. And then if you would input, same as with interstate lane additions, you would input the number of miles to be added and click Calculate Induced Travel, and you would have your answer. So that ends my prepared presentation. And I do have a slide, again, for posterity, for whoever accesses this once it's saved online. I have an additional slide with relevant resources. I won't go through them now. The slides will be posted so you can review the resources later. But with that, I'd like to welcome Chris Gansan and then Gordon Gary to provide thoughts on the calculator as guest respondents.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. So I wanted to first introduce Chris Gansan, who's a senior advisor for transportation in the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. He's the technical lead implementing SB 743, which Jamie mentioned in his presentation, and is currently the OPR's lead on automated vehicles. And he's previously held positions at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, World Resources Institute, US EPA Region 9, and is very well connected to a lot of these issues from the state level. Chris?
Hi there, thanks for the introduction first, and thanks for including me on this, giving me the chance to share my thoughts about this new tool. Just to introduce my office a little more, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, for those of you who aren't familiar, we're essentially the planning entity in state government. We, in our wheelhouse of the general plan guidelines, the CEQA guidelines, that's the guidelines for environmental review. And as many of you are aware, we've been working on a metric change for transportation impact within CEQA that I'll talk a little bit about in this context. Generally, we focus on outcomes, planning outcomes across environmental issues, health, economy, fiscal responsibility, affordability, and equity. So zooming out to the big picture, a kind of how are things going in transportation in the state. I want to point to a couple things, but first is a report out of the California Air Resources Board about 5 or 6 months ago. It's called the SB 150 report, or it's referred to as the SB 150 report, the legislation that had them produce it. But what's important is the data that it contained about whether or not we're on trajectory to hit our greenhouse gas targets in California, particularly what transportation is doing there. And the report unfortunately found that we're not on trajectory, that our policies say that we need to be reducing VMT per capita and GHG per capita, and our modeling says that we're on track to do that, but when you look at what's actually going on, the data says that we're not. Those things are increasing, and that's a big problem because transportation, just for climate, is half of the emissions in the state once you consider refining the fuel and piping it, those upstream emissions. But that growth in vehicle travel is also getting in the way of our providing affordable housing with reasonable and affordable commutes. It's getting in the way of cracking the nut on health, where we have a lot of chronic disease due to physical inactivity, and getting people out of cars and onto active transportation is important. And also more driving means more crashes. That's a big human health issue as well. And then just the general realm of environmental preservation has a lot of connections to the amount of vehicle travel. And meanwhile, traffic isn't so great either. So it is timely to take a hard look at what we achieve with our transportation infrastructure investments. And there are a lot of places at various levels of government where decisions are made and need to be informed. One of the mechanisms to inform those decisions is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And again, we've been working on a shift in CEQA that refocuses measuring transportation impact on VMT, on that total amount of vehicle travel. But it's not just important in light of this new policy to know what the effect on vehicle travel will be, because we've been studying greenhouse gases for about a decade in CEQA, energy impacts for longer than that, air quality, et cetera, those things that are a pivot from how much vehicle. So it's really important for all to know across all those outcomes what we're really going to get. It's important to have an accurate read on VMT. So it's in that context that I wanted to just provide a little bit of recommended in our advisory language to study VMT from a roadway capacity increase. But Jamey already described the method. It's simply the change in lane miles times the existing VMT times the elasticity. So it's very straightforward and transparent in methodology. It relies on directly on the academic studies, the empirical, the body of evidence we have on this. And what this calculator really contributes is it pulls the data together, so you don't have to go find those elements. And it also solves a problem that some people have hit in applying the simple formula, which is which roads are we looking at? Which functional classifications are we looking at? VMT when we apply that formula, are we looking at VMT on all the roads? Are we omitting local roads? And what the NCST researchers did was to look in detail at the academic literature and match the data to what the studies were doing, so that those elasticities really apply. So essentially, the tool matches up with and operationalizes the literature in a more refined and accurate way. And the results are tailored to the region or county, as Jamey was describing. You input that information, and the data within the tool has the information on existing traffic density in those locations, in those locales, making the tool sensitive to whether you're applying this in Bakersfield or Los Angeles, right? You're going to get different amounts of induced travel in those locations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of tool. In our advisory on implementing VMT in CEQA, we recommend this approach over use of travel demand models, generally speaking, for a few reasons. One is that travel demand models aren't able to factor in the land use effect of a highway capacity project. So you build a highway capacity project, you're going to change the way people invest in land use projects, the way development, the patterns over which development occurs. Generally, adding capacity are going to spread it out somewhat, and that's going to lead to increases in VMT. The travel demand models hold land use fixed, so they can't see that portion, and that's both important to get an accurate read on what the full outcome will be. It's also, legally speaking, a CEQA requirement to factor that in. So, there are other methods of factoring in land use as a post-processing kind of approach on travel demand models, using expert panels, using land use models. Though, generally speaking, those methods are not at the point of precision, or they essentially need checking. And the thing you check them with is the induced travel research. So we're back to using the elasticities again. We've also, in the travel demand models, noticed issues of excessive noise, where in some case study work we did with the MPOs, we saw that the effect of even a fairly large capacity increase was swallowed in the noise of the model. And of course, when you try and open the hood on these models and look inside and see what's going on, it's very difficult to do so. It's another reason to rely on a more simple and transparent approach. So I just want to summarize that we recommend using this tool on current and future induced travel assessments. So when you're looking to see the effects, not just on VMT, but on greenhouse gases, energy, other impacts, not the least of which traffic, when you're looking to assess those things, we recommend using this tool to assess the amount of vehicle travel that will result from the project. And that will allow us to be more clear-eyed about, again, what the outcomes for those along those factors, including congestion, what will be improved and what might not, and get a better handle on what our real substantial investments in transportation infrastructure might really get us. So I'll stop there and hand the baton to Gordon. Thanks again for giving me the opportunity to share.
Thanks, Chris, for that. One quick reminder to all the attendees, we'll be doing Q&A after Gordon finishes his remarks. So please, if you have any questions, get them into the Q&A window, and we will be taking questions from there. I'd like to introduce Gordon Gary now. Gordon describes himself as mostly retired after a long career in transportation planning. From 1990 to 2017, he was a senior staff member at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, where he developed and managed an increasing array of data and forecasting programs to support the agency's transportation, air quality, land use planning, and climate change efforts. He was largely responsible for all of their work on advanced transportation demand modeling. So, Gordon?
Good morning. Thanks. As well, my thanks as well as Chris's in terms of having the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I think this is a good step forward in understanding and putting out into a broader field of practitioners this very important effect that that induced demand has been sort of a topic of first curiosity and then investigation and then somewhat debate for quite a while, much before SB 743 was passed, much before SB 375 was passed. And so having this tool, and I agree with a lot of Chris's comments around the importance of this being focused and direct and to the point, and avoiding many of the operational problems that we've had with transportation demand models. And while induced demand has been important in making in driving sort of the importance of improving travel demand models, there's still a significant number of issues about using travel demand models for this particular very focused question, land impact and land growth inducement being a primary one, but not the only one. So I really appreciate that this work that Jamey and Susan have done has both produced a very useful tool, and I think it's useful for both the practitioners of CEQA analysis and other impact assessments, as well as I hope it becomes useful for policymakers and the general public in terms of this ongoing paradigm shift in terms of understanding and having a general agreement on what are the order of magnitude impacts of roadway investment policies. As Jamey presented in his remarks, that it was generally being seen as you widen roadways and it's always a good thing. Well, as this research points out, and as this tool provides evidence around, it's not that it is a more complicated picture, and having this tool available, I think, will help us understand that, and hopefully move toward the policy discussions as well as the analytical discussions around how roadway investments, particularly which are very long term, much longer term than the 10 years that the evidence around the appropriate elasticity refers to, that it's much longer investment than that. I mean, roadway investments are generational. And so I think it's hopefully it's very useful for that kind of policy discussion as well. One of the questions that I posed to Jamey, and maybe it'll help kick off the questions a little bit, is what would it take to expand this tool to class 2 and 3 facilities that are owned by and operated by cities and counties, not just Caltrans? Maybe he can talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think the research is very, very useful, but there is a lot of transportation investments that's off the Caltrans system. So maybe we could get into that just a little bit. And I also want to kind of echo Chris's comments around the fact that this is a very focused tool. And Jamey had mentioned the word sketch tool, and sketch tools often have this relationship between it being not very important. And I think that maybe sketch tool might be one term for it, but I think also kind of it's a focus tool that gets to this particular question and this particular set of impacts that travel demand models, as Chris mentioned, sort of has a noise effect. It's hard to tease out that this very focused effect that it's important to, like I said, to understand transportation investment impacts. And so I really hope that this tool does become useful, does become wide used, and continues and expands and becomes very widely used and widely acknowledged. I think at that point I'll stop my comments and we can get into the questions from the participants. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Thank you all for providing questions. We now have a little less than 20 minutes till 11, though I think given the number of questions, if our panelists are available, we may go a few minutes over and try to answer some more of them. I'd also say for those of you who have questions that we aren't able to answer right now, please feel free to follow up with Jamey or Susan Handy or myself. Email addresses are going to be in the slide deck. They'll also be on the follow-up email that we sent out, and we'd be happy to continue this conversation offline. So I think I'm going to try to take a couple of quicker clarification questions first before we get into some of the ones that might involve a bit of a meatier discussion, and just ask all of the panelists and respondents to try to be fairly concise so we can get to as many of these as possible, because several of these could launch a fairly involved discussion. One relatively quick one is the class 1, 2, and 3 data obtained from the pavement program.
The class 1, 2, and 3 data.
I think how do you figure out whether a particular road is class 1, 2, or 3 for the purposes of determining elasticity?
Right. So Caltrans has a great online map, which we link to from the Induced Calculator website, that shows by facility classification all the roads in California that are within class 1, class 2, and class 3, as well as other classifications. So you can look there. That's an easy place to start. Also, the Caltrans has, as our data shows, and the spreadsheet data that we have that you can link to from the website, also breaks down the lane miles by geography, by functional classification. So you can look there to just get totals. But Caltrans has great resources on this, and we've linked to some of those, a map and also a description of the functional classifications on the Induced Calculator website. So that should give people a good head start.
Great, thanks. Similar question, how is Caltrans PEMS data being applied to class 3 facilities?
Well, Caltrans manages some class 3 facilities, and they're within the California highway program, and they have data on some class 3 facilities, which you can see by also downloading the spreadsheet data that we have on the website.
Great. Do you know how frequently VMT data from Caltrans will be updated in the model?
I can't say for certain. We have to wait for the data to be obtained and tabulated by Caltrans, and then also allocated in a spreadsheet to the various roadways and the breakdown that we need it. So I can't give any specific update time frame, but we will do it as soon as we can, whenever the data becomes available.
Great. Next question is, can the tool calculate fractional miles for adding 1,000 feet of new lane at an intersection or sort of smaller projects? Do you feel it's appropriate for that use?
That's a great question. I think yes, generally. The studies from which we derive the elasticities, the data that they used involved, included all roadway expansions on the relevant facilities for the interstate or for other major roads. And so that included both major roadway expansions, which are multi-mile, and then also shorter roadway expansions that, maybe a mile or so, or even less.
All right. Thank you. Next question we have is, do you think the tool could be used in reverse? For example, if a county were to remove a certain number of lane miles, do you think it's useful for estimating the reduction in VMT?
No, the calculator is not appropriate for that. These studies on which our elasticities are based are only used to calculate the additional VMT from adding new lanes. I will also point out that the calculator would not be appropriate for looking at the induced travel effects of adding high occupancy toll lane, because the studies on which we relied were done prior to the explosion of using high occupancy toll lanes, and so we can't be sure what the impact of those would be relative to the high occupancy vehicle lanes, the carpool lanes, and general purpose lanes, which our calculator does apply to.
All right. Does the calculator offer any insight or impacts to local streets from a no-build alternative versus adding lane miles? And do you or Gordon or Chris have any thoughts on balancing that decision?
So let's see. Could you repeat that again, Colin?
The person was asking about impacts to local streets from a no-build alternative. So if you're analyzing a project which would potentially add lane miles to a highway facility, presumably there would be some reduction in local non-highway VMT because some of that traffic demand would flow onto the highway. So it doesn't, this calculator addresses that. Do you or Chris or Gordon have any thoughts on that balance?
So this calculator, so the one of the primary studies on which the calculator is based for the elasticities is the Duranton and Turner 2011 article, and they actually looked at the sources of where the induced travel, where the induced VMT was coming from, and one of the sources they looked at was whether the increased VMT on the highway facility or the interstate facility in that case was just from diverted traffic from local roads, and they concluded that there might be a minor impact of the diversion impact, but overall they concluded that there was an elasticity, an increased proportional increase in VMT to the increased lane miles regardless of the diversion. So VMT was increasing on the highways and not just being diverted from local roadways. So local roadway traffic would remain the same, and in some cases, when you have this increased, you have increased VMT on like one segment of an interstate or a highway, you're probably going to get increased congestion on the entry points and exit points from that expanded facility, just because now there's more traffic being funneled to and from the expanded facility.
So this is Susan. If I can add to that, the increase in VMT on the highway can come from multiple sources. So diversion is just one of those sources. And as Jamey said, the research suggests that that's relatively minor. But you think about the other kinds of behavioral adjustments that people make when new capacity is added. You know, they may choose to make more trips and they may choose to make longer trips. So that can contribute to additional VMT without removing VMT from local streets. And as Jamey says, it might even add to VMT on local streets.
Right. And then just to add on to Susan, just from the Durant and Turner article, they also did some analysis that showed that in addition to the travel behavior changes that led to additional VMT, there was also a sizable increase in commercial VMT, truck VMT, where the commercial truckers were using the better, newer facilities. And in some cases, they actually found a greater effect in non-urbanized areas because the truckers were using an area that had not been previously used a lot, and that was then inducing other, in the long term, even, you know, more economic activity along those corridors. And that's also another source of the long-term VMT, which is something that Chris alluded to as well, where you have land use changes and residential migration and firm relocation patterns that are all responsive to the expanded capacity in the short term, increasing mobility and accessibility in the area around the expanded facility.
Great. Gordon or Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that discussion?
No,
I thought that, yeah, nothing to add here.
Okay. Next question, is unmet demand for a project also defined as induced demand, or do you have any thoughts on sort of separating unmet need for transportation capacity from induced demand?
Well, I think one thing, it's important to separate out a demand or a need for auto travel versus a need for transportation generally. And when you have the expanded, when you have a facility expansion that reduces the cost of driving relative to other transportation modes, it will cause a shift from other modes. And so that's not the same as meeting some like latent unmet demand for driving. It's people making a choice to use a different mode based on reduced cost, or even in the long term make a relocation decision based on a reduced cost. So I think it's important to distinguish that a demand for driving versus just how the overall demand for transportation is being met.
All right, great. Next question, can you explain again what role geography plays in the tool's results? I think the question is largely how does the representation of the local transportation network affect the way that the tool views this question?
So the tool looks at all of the facilities of the same classification type in the relevant geography. So for interstate facilities, it would look at all of the interstate lane miles in a metropolitan statistical area, all of the current, or as of 2016, vehicle miles traveled in that area, and then it would calculate what % change in that geographic specific, facility type specific lane miles, what impact that % change would have on VMT. And so for the class 2 and 3 facilities, that those geographies are smaller than metropolitan statistical areas. Those are within the 37 urbanized counties within California.
All right. And in a kind of similar question, can we use this tool in a non-American context?
I think so you could not use this tool to estimate VMT from any induced VMT from any particular facility expansion in a non-US context. However, the same principles apply, and even the same or very similar elasticities seem to apply. There was a recent, within the last 5 years, I think, study that came out of Japan that I think showed an elasticity of around 1.0 as well for major roadways, major highways there. So I think the principles are the same, but the calculator could not be used outside of the specific jurisdictions, the specific counties and metropolitan statistical areas within California.
I'll just add, this is Chris, that's in large part because we have California data in the tool. Again, it's saying what Jamey said in a different way. If you brought data in from another state, or the research is largely applicable across the country. Internationally, Jamey pointed to some research. You might need to look and verify that the elasticities are the same there, but maybe there are indications that they are, and then get the local VMT and land mal data.
Great. So we've gone through about half of the questions that are coming in, and I'm really glad to see so much interest. Jamey, Susan, Gordon, and Chris, are you available to stay on for maybe an additional 10 to 15 minutes to try to get through a few more of these before we wrap up and take the rest offline?
Sure.
Yes, I am.
I am as well.
Me too.
All right, sounds great. Then let's keep moving through. The question was to why C2 roadways have a different elasticity than C1, since qualitatively they seem fairly similar.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that goes to our being careful to be specific about the elasticities or the studies that we chose for calculating elasticities for our calculator. So the 1.0 elasticity is primarily from the Durant and Turner 2011 study, and that study looked at interstates in metropolitan statistical areas across the U.S. So it did not look at state highways or other major roadways. And so, just to be honest to the data that study applied to, we're not applying that elasticity to roadways that the study didn't measure. And so, however, like that study was great for interstates. There's also a great study which we used for the class 2 and 3 facilities, which comes from a 2002 study that used as its data Caltrans class 2, class 3, and class 1 facilities in the urbanized counties in California. And so the data much more closely matches the facility types for class 2 and class 3, and all within California. And that study showed an elasticity of closer to 0.75. And so that's why we went with that study. In addition, the Durant and Turner study did look not with their preferred model, but they did also look at major roadways aside from interstates, and in their estimations of the induced travel effect on other major roadways, not interstates, they also arrived at a slightly lower elasticity for those facilities. And so that's why we have the split elasticities for the 3 types of facilities.
All right, thank you. Next question, does the tool provide a VMT breakdown for different classes of vehicles like autos and trucks? And if not, what do you think is needed in order to start trying to get to that level of granularity?
No, the calculator does not provide a breakdown by vehicle type. And to get to that level of granularity, Yeah, you just need much more specific data on the types of vehicles that are traveling on each type of facility. So we need to have data by facility, by vehicle type, and our data is more general than that.
If I might add here that these are all really excellent questions, and the calculator is limited by the research that has been done. So to be able to add some of these nuances to the method would require research to be done that would let us understand, how the elasticity varies in different situations. So that's my plug for more funding for research on this question so that we can, add some sophistication to the tool.
All right. Next question is, do you have a tool that calculates induced VMT per capita? I guess maybe sort of a follow on to that is do you feel it would be appropriate to use these data dividing by population within the region to get something that informs compliance with things like SB 375?
That's a good question, Chris. As someone from the regulatory world, do you have any insights on that?
Could you repeat that? I just want to make sure I understood it.
The specific question was, do you have a tool that calculates VMT per capita? I don't think this one does, but do you feel like the VMT results could be sort of extended and used to arrive at a VMT per capita impact? Because there are some policies, particularly in California, that focus on VMT per capita?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I can take that one. We thought about this a lot as we were developing our recommendations for methodology on SB 743, the change to VMT, because we're shifting the metric to VMT and CEQA. We need to describe to people how they might assess it. And at the beginning, we're thinking, okay, using VMT per capita might make sense, but we're looking at transportation projects, and it's the trouble is, what's the capita that you're talking about? Is it the city's population? Is it the population of people who will use it each day? That changes if you add capacity to the roadway. So it's very difficult, and that definition of what the capita is that you're putting in the denominator turns out to dominate the results of whatever you're studying. So we found that it's better when assessing a transportation investment to just look at the net change. Do you increase vehicle travel or do you decrease vehicle travel? And that's kind of a more policy relevant and workable way to think about the impacts of transportation investments.
And on a related question, do you feel like this can be used to calculate VMT per capita in terms of throughput on a given piece of freeway?
I would, so I'm just speaking off the cuff here, but I'd have concerns. Again, what is the per capita that we're talking about, right? Is it which are the people that we're talking about serving? So it's actually kind of it gets into a funny and really wonky question of what do we exactly mean by that question. And I think there's a little bit of ambiguity. We could maybe get to something interesting in a longer discussion, but generally speaking, we spent a long time trying to wrap our heads around that question in the context of developing recommendations on implementing SB 743, and came to stepping away from the per capita, thinking about VMT per capita in the transportation investment context. It's just very difficult to figure out what you're using for the number of people.
This is Gordon Gary. Let me just add to this just a little bit, and it goes back to the 743 discussions, and I was kind of part of that stuff that Chris and OPR led. I mean, my perspective is, in a CEQA context where you're comparing alternatives, that the per capita part doesn't really matter, because the number of people within your study area shouldn't change from alternative to alternative. No transportation project, I think, is going to be large enough that it's going to either induce additional population or restrict population across those alternatives. And so from a CEQA comparison perspective, I think the number of people sort of doesn't matter, and the total VMT is what matters. And so you get the same result if you're doing total VMT or a per capita calculation.
All right, thank you. Next question we have is, do you think you could create a batch run option to run through a list of projects to get multiple results quickly? For example, running it for an RTP?
We haven't currently thought about doing that, but that's a interesting suggestion. We'll take that under advisement.
Great. All right. Next, and this may be a somewhat more open-ended question, but still very relevant. What type of mitigation might be required for capacity increasing freeway projects to counteract the induced VMT per SB 743? This may be more of a Chris question, but to some extent I think it's a little more general and open-ended.
Sure, I'm happy to take this one first. You know, there's a whole array of travel demand management approaches. In some cases, travel systems management approaches can help to manage the amount of vehicle travel induced or mitigate it. You know, ultimately, we know a very strong and effective tool is various kinds of pricing, where you know, examples are in San Francisco, they worked with parking pricing in order to reduce demand to their downtown area and help with traffic, but also environmental and other factors. There's cordon pricing, which is being explored in a few of the major cities, a price to drive into the center of a city. There's VMT pricing or congestion pricing, which is basically pricing when there's scarce space on the roads, pricing it, kind of rationalize use of the roads. And there's also, critically, there are ways of doing that that improve rather than worsen equity. We need to be concerned about lower income earners whenever you talk about pricing. But pricing is a widely and very strongly effective approach in addition to the other approaches I mentioned.
All right. The next question we had was, how does VMT help me mitigate congestion at the intersections? I think this may be getting at differences between expanding intersection capacity versus expanding lane miles.
This is Chris. I can give a quick answer, and others might want to chime in as well. But the less vehicle travel there is, the less the fewer vehicles are going through the intersection. That's the simple answer.
Gordon or Jamey or Susan, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, if I understood the question right, I think Chris has answered it. I want to go back to the previous question and just to add a thought there that Chris is right about all of the various kinds of strategies that can be used to help address congestion issues. But I think, you know, what all this research on induced travel really suggests is that we should be thinking very seriously about whether highway capacity is something we should even be considering. So, you know, it's possible that the same objective can be achieved with the mitigation strategies without adding the capacity, right? So if you're talking about capacity with mitigation, step back and think about, can you achieve the goals without the capacity expansion?
Great, okay. Next question we have, if a project is shown to increase VMT, how do you determine if it's a significant impact under CEQA or a non-significant impact? Is any increase in VMT considered significant?
So this is Chris again. We've also thought about this quite a bit in providing our recommendations on significant levels of VMT from a roadway project. And what we come back to is connecting VMT to our climate goals. Essentially, are we adding enough VMT that it would contravene achieving our greenhouse gas emissions goals? And if we are, then that should be a significant impact. The California Air Resources Board provides an amount of VMT that we can grow and still hit our climate goal. So it's a matter of crosswalking that to the project level.
All right. Next question we had is, how are state DOTs including induced demand into their planning?
This is Chris again. I certainly don't have a catalog of what everyone's doing, but my sense is that across state DOTs, the induced travel effect is widely under-considered and undercounted. In fact, there's beginning to be a body of academic literature on why that is, given the clarity of the science. But yeah, it's not accounted for or fully accounted for very frequently. It's my understanding.
And that's my understanding as well.
All right.
Same here.
Okay. This, I think, may be the last question. And we are definitely not through the entire stack of questions. There's a number of good ones I wish we had time for, but I don't want to go too far over. And also some of these I think probably need much longer discussions and in more depth than we can accommodate here. So I think we'll call it the last one. If we weren't able to get to your question, please follow up with Jamey or Susan, whose contact information will be in the slide deck as well as on the follow-up email that comes out. So I think the last question is, to what degree does the underlying elasticities reflect increased demand over time from population growth? Are they more appropriately applied to growing attractive regions than declining or static regions?
So for example, the study Durant and Turner 2011 on which we base the 1.0 elasticity we use for interstate lane mile additions, that was a study of all metropolitan statistical areas across the United States that had any interstate lane miles within their boundaries. And so that included a wide variety of metropolitan statistical areas. And I would say generally, especially if there's congestion on the road in the first place, then you can probably expect a similar induced travel effect in the long term. And even as I was mentioning earlier, even in areas that may not have existing congestion, if a new or expanded facility provides a better roadway or access to an area that was previously not easily accessible, that can also have a similar induced travel impact.
To add to that, induced travel does not depend on population growth. It happens with the existing population.
All right. Well, I'd like to extend a very heartfelt thanks to all of our speakers and panelists, Jamey Volker, Susan Handy, Chris Gansan, and Gordon Gary. We sincerely appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise here today. I also like to thank all of the attendees. And so on behalf of our speakers and everyone here at NCST, thank you and have a great rest of your day.